Okay, so well, first of all, good morning, good afternoon, and perhaps I guess good evening to some of you. Thanks for joining my session. And before we have a look at the agenda for today, I'd like to thank Eric, of course, for having me today on the Virtual Expo. I think it's a great initiative, and hopefully many more will follow in the years to come. So as for the agenda for today, I'll start out with a short introduction on who I am and what I do. Then I'd like to continue with a short overview on Microsoft printing in general, including the piece, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes. Then some history on Microsoft print drivers, to be a bit more specific, and some extras in there as well. And of course, we're going to have a look at the Citrix printing pathways today, sort of the main topic of this presentation. And we'll have a look at some of the universal stuff as well, the universal print server, the universal printer, and of course the UPD, the universal print driver as well. And as you can see, there's sort of a main topic bar at the top of my screen. So each time I've discussed one of the main topics, I'd like to also go over some of the defaults and best practices that go with some of the technologies or perhaps products that I may have discussed as part of one of those main topics. So just so you know what's going on. Who am I? Well, that's an easy one, of course, at least for me. My name is Bas van Kaam. I am a senior consultant at this time, and I've been in IT for about 16 years now. I work for a company called Detron. It's a Dutch company based in the Netherlands and basically one of the leading VDI and SBC consulting companies at this time. And if I look at my work experience during the past 10 to 15 years, then most of my work experience comes from Microsoft related projects, although I have been focusing on the Citrix portfolio more specific as of late 2012, early 2013. But of course, I'm also keeping an eye on all the other stuff that all the other guys are doing, of course. So I'm an occasional speaker, and you may also know me from my personal website blog on basvankaam.com, on which I'm pretty active as well. If you haven't, go and have a look. You might find something of interest on there. This is my first webinar ever, actually, so please be gentle. Although I'd like to receive any feedback that you might have, of course, after the session, positive, negative, because, I'd like to learn as well. So if we aren't connected yet on Twitter, look me up. We'll connect on there as well. And as far as the overview is concerned, the piece, I'll explain them, of course. I'm talking about the printing device, the print driver, the print spooler, and so on and so forth. And I think we can probably come up with a few more if we give it a few minutes. But it's basically meant to to bring these together to see what happens after a user clicks print, sort of to give you a high-level overview on what's happening under the hood, so to speak. So a user clicks print. An application will come up with some sort of print output, which in most cases will be rendered by the GDI first, turning it into a meta file, and then it will be sent back over to over to the spooler service. This is sort of basic behavior if you're using the EMF print file format, and we also have the XPS print file format. And I'll discuss both in the next slide in a bit more detail as well. Just for now, know that with EMF, it will be rendered by the GDI in most cases, sent over to the spooler service, and with XPS, the print output will be sent from the application right over to the spooler service. Anyway, from there, the spooler service will hand it over to any local installed print driver, which will render the data and turn it into an actual print job, which will be sent back to the spooler service over to a physical printing device. This is, of course, sort of basic printing on a local machine, no terminal services involved or whatsoever. So, but we'll get to that in just a few minutes. With regards to XPS and EMF, the print file formats, as mentioned just now, I'd like to spend another 2 minutes or so on both. One of the biggest differences between the two, as we've seen on the previous slide, is that with EMF, it needs to be the print output needs to be rendered by the GDI first before it is sent over to the spooler service, and with XPS it will be sent over right away. And it sort of depends on how your application is written or coded or compiled, programmed, whatever you like to call it, if it will either use EMF or XPS. So you can't really influence that. So depending on the type of application you use, it will either use the EMF print file format or XPS. Now, EMF is sort of considered legacy today, but that's because it was basically all we had up to Windows XP and Windows Server 2003, and XPS was introduced as of Windows Vista. So you can probably imagine how many applications still depend on EMF. Some more differences between the two, because XPS will also compress all the print output and EMF does not. EMF also has to redraw each image that it encounters within the same document, even if the same image is used multiple times within the same document, for example, if you're using watermarks, company logos, that sort of stuff. And XPS only has to do it one time and then can reuse it afterwards. So it's more aimed to graphics, so to speak. Also for your applications to be able to actually use the XPS print file format, both your print driver and your physical printing device need to support it. Otherwise it will be converted back to EMF, and the same goes for EMF as well. It can also convert print data or print output over to XPS to make it fully compatible. If we think back 2 slides where the data or the print output is received by the spooler servers, which will be then rendered by a print driver into a print job, sent back over to the spooler servers to a printer, this is what we actually refer to as print spooling. So just so you know, if they're talking about this is basically what happens at a high level underneath the hood, so to speak. So with regards to print spooling, if we have a client and a physically attached printer, the user will click print from within an application, will send it over to the printer, and then all spooling will happen locally on the client, which also means that it will consume resources local to the client. Now, if we throw in a print server, then all printing will take place, or spooling will take place on the print server, which from a client perspective means that spooling will take place remotely. Again, consuming resources on the print server itself, but it also means that some network traffic will be generated between the client device and the print server. So that's something you need to be aware of, because within larger environments this can be sort of a bottleneck, and it has to be thoroughly tested. So this is no multi-user yet, of course, but if we throw in an RDS-TS server, a Citrix server in this case, then it will be. So the client will have a session on the RDS server. User will hit print, will send it over to the print server and over to the printer, which again means that spooling will take place physically on the print server, and from a client perspective, again, spooling will take place remotely because the client will have a session on the RDS server, of course. So now, if we look back a couple of years, and perhaps even today, then 90% of all print issues were, or perhaps still are, print driver related, and things that can or would go wrong, services would crash, auto print creation would fail, blue screens, high CPU loads, and so on and so forth. And this was all basically because print drivers were badly coded, badly written, not optimized for multi-user environments, not tested or signed by the bigger companies. For example, if you look back at Microsoft Windows NT, all we had back then were version 2 kernel mode drivers, which of course ran in kernel mode, which also meant that if something went wrong, you would basically lose the whole machine. Now, shortly after that, Windows 2000 introduced version 3 printer drivers, which ran or run in user mode. And well, basically the same rules apply. If something were to go wrong with some of those drivers, then you'll at least lose the user mode section of that specific server. Now with Windows Server 2008 R2, they introduced a mechanism, or Microsoft introduced a mechanism, which would automatically block the installation of version 2 kernel mode drivers, which of course is a good thing. And they also introduced a feature called print driver isolation, which consists out of, well, 3 nodes: none, shared, and isolated. And of course, it would still leverage all of the print drivers today. So version 3 and even version 4 drivers today, they are run in user mode as well. And well, 3 modes, if you would apply none, then basically it's the same as always. All the print drivers would run in user mode together. So if something goes wrong, you would lose that section of your server. Still a big part, of course, but yeah. If shared is applied, it works a bit differently, because then you can combine multiple print drivers into a separate process, which is named the print isolation host process, and it runs separately from all other installed print drivers, and it also runs separately from the print spooler servers, for example. So again, in user mode, but if something were to go wrong with some of those, or one or multiple of those drivers, then again you would only lose that specific section. So all other users on the same machine could continue to work because yeah, well, all other installed print drivers won't be affected because the others would be isolated from those. Now with the isolated mode, basically the same rules apply as with shared, only isolated is applied on a per print driver level. So each driver would get its own print isolation host mode, a separate process in which it would run, and each driver would then be isolated from all others, including the print spooler service. Now this, in theory, this all sounds well, great, of course, but a few things you need to be aware of, because when each specific or each individual print driver gets its own isolated process, it also means that it will consume a lot more from the physical machine itself. So it will consume a lot more resources, especially if you were going to apply it multiple times, tens, dozens of times, for example. And also there might be a specific reason why that specific, or why those specific print drivers need to be isolated from all the others. So you might want to ask yourself, okay, what is that reason, and do I really want to use that type or that kind of a driver in my production environment? So Citrix also says use it, at least the isolation mode, for testing purposes only, or for troubleshooting, for example, on your live environment, and use shared in production mode only. Yeah, of course you can apply isolated in production without any issues. You just need to be aware of, well, okay, why does it need to be isolated? Is that a bad thing or not? And the extra resources that it might consume, you also need to be aware of that. So we also have version 4 mode drivers today. As of Windows Server 2012, those can be isolated as well, of course. They also run in user mode, so basically the same rules apply as with all the other stuff I just showed you. And these are basically designed for the newer types of applications, all based on XPS, Metro style. They also support a larger amount of printer types, enhanced printer sharing, and they should be a lot easier to install, maintain, and a lot more stable as well. So if we have a look at some of the defaults that go with this, then if needed, Citrix will install native Windows print drivers by default, because what happens is, as soon as a user has a session on the Citrix server, during logon, for example, then Citrix will check the print drivers installed on the client device, and it will try to match those with locally installed print drivers on the Citrix machine. So if it can find any, and those need to be exactly the same, by the way, so the names have to be alike, the version numbers have to be the same, and so on and so forth. So if it can find any, it will try and install Windows native drivers from the base OS, from the XenOp server itself. For this behavior, to change this behavior, because this might be something that you don't want to, you should configure the automatic installation of inbox printer drivers, just so that you know. And if it can't find any usable drivers at all, it will try and use the UPD instead, the universal print driver, which of course we will have a look at later in the presentation as well in a bit more detail, which you don't have to separately install because it's part of the XenOp VDA installation on your session host, so to speak, but you do need to enable it because it will be disabled by default. Now you might also want to consider to use something called print driver mapping and compatibility, because there might be situations where you would like your XenOp server to automatically install certain drivers, and then with print driver mapping and compatibility you can set up sort of a whitelist containing specific print drivers, telling the system, well, okay, if you want to go and auto install print drivers, that's okay, but they need to be on this list, and otherwise use the UPD instead, for example. Now some of the best practices, or sort of a recap on this portion of the presentation, is of course you sign print drivers exclusively if you can. Thoroughly test your print architecture setup. No matter how sure you are that it will work, test it anyway, just do it. Limit the number of print drivers installed as much as you can, because less is more in this case, and of course use version 3 and 4 drivers only. And this is, well, again, sort of an important one. Use print driver isolation where it makes sense. So to test, to troubleshoot, or in production if you have thought it through. Consider print driver mappings to native drivers, which is sort of the same policy as I just mentioned with the whitelisting of print drivers. what you can do is you can tell the system to use a certain driver or multiple drivers to match the print drivers installed on the client device, even though the names don't exactly match or the version numbers don't exactly match. So you know that they provide the exact same functionality, so you can tell the system use this print driver to match the one on the client device. It has to be this type. I know the names are different, but it will work, trust me. And of course, if you look at comparing print drivers on, for example, your XenUp servers when troubleshooting, for example, and your client devices, don't just look at the driver names, look at the version numbers as well, because if those are different, it won't work as well. So always try to avoid upgrades and uninstall print drivers and install them instead fully if you can. And if needed, contact the print driver vendor. For example, if they can only offer you version 2 mode drivers today, then well, you don't want to use those today. So contact the vendor, contact Citrix, or see what you can work out. And always try to match the print server OS, the OS on the print server, with that of the Citrix RDS OS as well. Now, another component which is installed by default on every XenUp server is the Citrix Print Manager service. It got introduced around 2005, which is about the same time that the EMF-based universal print driver within Citrix got introduced as well. And some of the things it does is it communicates with the spooler service, which can be remote, of course, if we were to use a print server, for example, but it could also be local to the Citrix server as well. It also communicates with the ICA client on the Citrix server. But this is something we'll discuss in a bit more detail as part of the client printing pathway in a few minutes' time. And the same applies to this one as well, because it can compress data before, in this case print data, before it sends it over through the ICA virtual channel from the local Citrix server. Again, this is something we'll discuss in a bit more detail when talking about the client printing pathway. And it's also responsible for managing the ICA virtual channel for client print mapping. So again, useful to know if you're having issues troubleshooting, check the service. And this is sort of outdated information. I've asked around within Citrix. A few people couldn't get a response, so I assume this is still valid. If not, it's not my fault, sorry. So from an overview perspective, we've seen this one before, then this is where you might find the Citrix Print Management Service. As mentioned, it communicates with the spooler service, which can also be remote, of course, in the case of a print server, for example. And it also communicates with the ICA client. And again, when it does that, we are talking about the client printing pathway, which I'll discuss in a few slides at time. So what's wrong today? Basically the same old, because we still have to deal with, well, this stuff, slow printing, spikes, server crashes, auto creation, and so on and so forth. A big list still. With regards to these issues, if we can relate them back to a print issue, because there are, of course, multiple reasons why these issues might happen, but if we can relate them back to a print issue, then in 90%, or at least in most cases, it will still be driver related today. And the same applies to slow printing and delayed logons, for example. Again, there might be multiple dozens of reasons why printing is slow, why logons are delayed, and so on. But if we can relate it back to a print issue, then in most cases, and this could be, of course, 70 or 80%, but it will be related to your print architecture, your physical setup, for example. Which brings me to the Citrix printing pathways. We basically have two, the client and the network printing pathway, and with these pathways we can basically control how print traffic is routed throughout our print architecture, or print environment, I must say. And I'd like to start out with server local printers, which isn't really a pathway, but it's in there as well, which basically means you have a client session on your Citrix server and a locally attached physical printer to your XenUp machine. So I haven't come across this setup that much, perhaps only once, but just so you know, you can use it. When using this setup, spooling will take place local, because local from a client perspective as well. On the Citrix server, the client will have a session on the Citrix server, of course, so that's why spooling will take place locally from a client perspective as well, before sending it over to the locally attached physical printer. Now, the real first pathway, which is the client printing pathway, again, a client device with a locally attached printer. The client will have a session on the Citrix server, produces some sort of print output after clicking print within an application. That print output will be sent back over the ICA channel back to the client, and the client will send it over to the physical printer, which is locally attached as well. Now here, spooling will take place on the Citrix server. So again, from a client perspective, this will be spooled locally. And if we separate the two with an office and a data center, and we put a few miles between them, then the data sent between the Citrix server and the client device will still be compressed, but because they can communicate over ICA. So something to remember. Now, with locally attached printers within Citrix, if you use locally attached printers, then it will always force the client printing pathway, which I just showed you guys. So this one is important to remember. Now, with the network printing pathway, it works a bit different. The client will still, of course, have a session on the Citrix server, but from there, the print output will be sent over to the print server, and from the print server, of course, to the network provisioned printer. Spooling will take place on the print server. So again, from a client perspective, from the Citrix server, it will be spooled remotely this time on the print server. And if we put some space between them, separate the two within an office and a data center, we put a few miles between them, then we'll see that the data sent from the print server to the printer will be uncompressed. So something to be aware of course, because both can communicate over ICA, so you have to come up with something else. Now, if we move the print server physically from the data center back to the office and still using the network printing pathway with network provisioned printers, then same rules apply basically, because the client will have again a session on the Citrix server, and then the Citrix server will send over the print output to the print server over to the printer. Now this will again be uncompressed because the Citrix server as well as the print server are both not capable of talking over ICA, so there's no way for us to compress or manage the traffic sent between the Citrix server and the print server, at least not from a basic Citrix setup. Now here, the universal print server is optional because it's supposed to be capable of compressing the print output sent between the Citrix server and the print server. However, just recently Citrix wrote a blog post, I think it's about 4 or 5 weeks ago, in where they tested this universal print server setup, and then specifically had a look at some of the numbers involved. So with compression, it turned out that the print output sent from the Citrix server over to the print server wasn't compressed at all, or very minimal. So this is something that you'll have to test within your own production environment or a larger test environment to be sure that it works, because yeah, although the documentation still says that it's one of the biggest features of the universal print server, one of their own blogs now says that it doesn't work. So yeah, needs to be tested. With network printers, just as with the locally attached or the physical printers, the locally attached printers, which will always force to use the client printing pathways, if network printers are used, if they're network provisioned through a print server, then Citrix will always try and use the network printing pathway. So again, something to remember. Now, if we have a look at the same setup, you can see some of the differences between the two, because just a few slides ago we were applying the network printing pathway on this setup, but if we force it to use the client printing pathway, so the client will again have a session on the Citrix server, but this time it won't be the print output won't be sent over from the Citrix server to the print server because of the client printing pathway. It will be sent back to the client over ICA, so we can apply compression and we can sort of manage it. Of course, from the client to the print server it will be uncompressed, but those will be relatively close together over a fast LAN, so that won't be an issue, and the same applies to the traffic sent from the print server over to the printer. Like I mentioned, this will be compressed. However, I also mentioned that if you use network provisioned printers, Citrix will always by default use the network printing pathway, and with locally attached it will always use the client printing pathway. So there must be a reason, or a method which we can apply to force the system to use the client printing pathway instead of the network printing pathway. while still using network provisioned printers. And we do that by disabling the direct connections to print service policy. This way we can force, although we are using network provisioned printers, we can still force it to route the traffic over the client printing pathway. Now, you need to be careful with this because depending on your physical setup, it can also complicate things. Because if you look at this setup, separated between the office and the data center, again, the client printing pathway, the print output will be sent back to the client. Of course, it will be compressed because we can use the ICA channel for this. But when it is sent from the client back to the print server, because of the client printing pathway that gets applied in this setup, it will be uncompressed. And the same goes for the data sent from the print server back to the printer. It also has to traverse the line. It has to traverse the line multiple times, and it will be uncompressed. So try to avoid this setup, or at least be careful with it, because your lines might be fast, for example. Bandwidth might not be an issue. Then this setup won't hurt that much. But if you have enough bandwidth between your office and your data center, then you still want to avoid this, because this way you will send data over the line 3 times, while if you have enough bandwidth and you use the network printing pathway instead of the client printing pathway with this setup, it will only have to traverse the line 1 time. So something to consider as well. Now, these two I already mentioned. But there is an exception, because if the Citrix server and the print server are not in the same domain and there's no trust configured between the two, so they can't directly communicate, then the system, then Citrix, will automatically force the print traffic to be routed over the client printing pathway, even if network printers are provisioned. And the same applies, or the same thing happens when no connection is available at all. So even when the Citrix server and the print server are in the same domain, but because some sort of a network hiccup, for example, or for whatever reason, if there's no connection, then the client printing pathway will be forced as well. And thin clients can make use of the client printing pathway, which is very important to mention as well, because if you think back a few slides where I showed you the client printing pathway, where the Citrix server and the client communicated over the ICA channel for a remote office setup, for example. If you're using thin clients exclusively, that setup won't work. So that's something to take note of as well. Now, some of the best practices, or sort of a recap again. You can understand why it's important to know the differences and the implications of both pathways, and of course there's no one-size-fits-all. For example, putting the Citrix and the print server close together isn't just always the best solution. And all this applies to XenApp as well as XenDesktop. There are some differences between the two with regards to the print pathways and some of the other print stuff, but all that I'm talking about here today applies to both architectures. So. Universal here, of course I'm talking about the universal print driver, the universal print server, and of course also the universal printer. So let's first have a look at the universal print driver. It's basically meant as one driver to rule them all. So the less drivers you have to install on your XenApp machine, the better off you will be. It supports some advanced printing features like stapling and sorting, and it's available in both EMS and XPS. Now, it will be used by the print server if it's available as well as the universal printer, as we'll see in just a few minutes. And some of the defaults that go with it, and I already mentioned this earlier, it is disabled by default, so you will have to configure the universal print driver usage policy to enable it, and there's also a preference policy that go with it, in where you can say, for example, always exclusively use the UPD, or just use the UPD when no native drivers are available, for example. And you have a few options in there as well. Now, EMF is the EMF-based UPD is based by default. This you can change to XPS if you want to, and like I mentioned, it's part of the VDA installation, so no separate install, you just need to enable it. It sort of looks like this. Normally you would have multiple clients with one or multiple print drivers installed on them, and those would have to be matched on the Citrix server as well, so you have to install them as well to be fully compatible, which of course can lead to corruption and well, all sorts of nasty stuff. And the general thought behind it is to install the universal print driver which can then communicate with all drivers installed in your client devices, making life a bit easier. At least that's the general thought. Now, whenever possible, you would like to use the UPD exclusively, of course, because then you would only have one driver, nothing more. But in most cases, you would want to use it combined with some of the Windows native drivers to be able to make use of some of the advanced printing features, because it does support some advanced features, but well, not much, as we've seen in one of the previous slides. It can be used together with the Universal Print Server, of course, as we'll see in just a minute. And for example, like I mentioned, you could configure it to try the native Windows drivers first, if available. If not, then use the UPD, for example, or vice versa. Which brings us to the Universal Printer, which is sort of a special one. It's a bit hard to explain as well, because it may sound a bit abstract, but I have a few images coming up as well, which make it hopefully a bit more clearer. Because with the Universal Printer enabled, print mapping within the user session when the user logs on, or print enumeration, or whatever you like to call it, doesn't happen, because when a user logs on and the Universal Printer is enabled, a generic printer object or a logical printer object will be created at the beginning of the session, which will then be mapped to the default printer, which is default behavior as well, on the client device. And it also only works for Windows-based clients only. If we have a look at some of the defaults, it will also, like I already mentioned, leverage the UPD by default. It maps to the client default printer, which I also mentioned, but this can also be modified so that you can map it to one of the other printers which is known on the client device. It sort of looks like this. You also have to know that with Citrix, if you don't change the default behavior, then when a user logs in, it will try to map or enumerate all the printers known to the client device of the user within the Citrix session, which is in most cases not something you would like. So in a lot of cases, you would configure a policy to auto-create the default client printer only, which sort of looks like this. The user would log in, a session gets established, the user will get a session on the Citrix server, and then print enumeration or mapping will kick in, and then the default printer will be mapped within the session. This is how it normally would work, sort of. Now with the Universal Printer, same rules apply, at least at the beginning. The session will be established, the user will get a session on the Citrix server, only now there's no mapping or print enumeration, but a logical object will be created as part of the session, at the beginning of the session, which of course will be a lot faster than print enumeration, print mapping, which will then be mapped to the local printer, which is again default behavior. But you can change that to for it to be mapped to any printer which is known to the client device. So this is sort of in a nutshell how the Universal Printer works. And of course it's used in smaller environments basically to decrease login times, because no print mapping or enumeration has to take place. Also when the wait for printer to be created policy is used, which is needed for some applications, this helps, of course, makes it a bit faster. And when you need to use or access multiple printers locally attached on a network, you can use this one as well. So could be helpful. Now the Universal Print Server, it's built out of a server and a client component. It also uses the Citrix UPD, but it can also be paired with Windows native drivers if needed, because of some of the advanced printing features, for example, that the UPD doesn't support. It's optimized for network printers, basically only supports network printers, and well, again, it's supposed to offer some compression, advanced compression options between the Citrix server and the print server over at the office. That's the idea behind it. And it supports both EMF and the XPS print file format, including thin clients and tablet devices. Now, this is sort of how it looks. As you can see, on the left near the bottom a UP client, and on the right at the top a UP server component. An application will again produce some sort of print output, which will be handed over to the print subsystem, over to the Citrix UPD, but in this case it won't do anything with the print data, because the local rendering of data, the local processing of data with the Universal Print Server isn't supported. So it will be handed over from the UPD to the Citrix UP client software basically right away, which will then hand it over to the client component of the universal print server, and this is the part you are supposed to be able to control from the Citrix to the print server. And then basically from there the print server will take over and spool the data and send it over to well, to a physical print device. And visually it will look something like this. Of course the client will again have a session on the Citrix server, a server and a client component will be installed, and after a user clicks print on the Citrix server, then the universal print server software is supposed to be able to compress the data from the Citrix server over to the print server, which will then be sent from the print server over to the printer, and of course it will then be printed, which in theory sounds just awesome. However, again, my reference over to the yeah. Yes, okay, thank you. However, again, referring to the blog series, this needs to be tested. Some of the defaults, when implemented, again, you will have to enable it by configuring the Universal Print Server Enable policy. Universal Print Server will also try to use any Windows native print drivers if available, and otherwise it will try to use the UPD instead, which of course you also need to enable, otherwise it won't work. And any network printers on your network will automatically leverage the UPS if it's enabled and configured, which is referred to as auto discovery. For now it's only officially supported for Windows Server 2008 R2. But as Jerry and Gibson pointed out to me, and I thought I'll include it in here as well, it's the tech preview of the UPS, the tech preview for Windows Server 2012 R2 is included with the Windows 10 VDA tech preview as well. So there wasn't a big announcement. The announcement was part of the Windows 10 VDA blog that Citrix released, well, I think a few months ago now. But just so you know, it's there. It can only support, it supports up to 50 print jobs per minute, and again it does not support client-side rendering. Recommended for remote office scenarios if you can get the compression to work, of course, and for the use of large amount of network printers, which well, sort of speaks for itself. And if you use the Universal Print Server, you can also enable something called proximity printing, on which you can apply something called session printer, which is basically a network printer to a user based on their IP address or subnet, for example, that they're based in, which hopefully I'll get, yeah, this, I was wondering how much time I've left, but I'll just continue until Eric stops me. This will only take me 3 to 4 minutes tops. I've named this one Accelerate because, well, it's not really a best practice per se. Printing traffic within the ICA protocol, its virtual channel has the lowest priority, but you can give it a higher priority if you really need to by adjusting or configuring this specific registry entry. And you will need to look up the CDX CMP and configure it to something lower than 3, because within the ICA channels the priorities run from 0 to 3, with 0 being the highest. CTX CMP will have 3, so you will have to change it to 2, 1, 0 or whatever. But again, not a best practice per se, so you need to think this through, because giving a higher priority, in this case to printing for example, but to a virtual channel in general, also means that you're taking away priority from other virtual channels. So think this through, test it carefully before implementing in production. Excuse me. Of course, we can also accelerate ICA traffic in general using a physical appliance, for example, a cloud bridge, an F5, or whatever you might come across. We can also configure multiple policies within Citrix and then control the bandwidth used, and then either apply them to on a per user basis, per server basis, or to the whole site. And use, yeah. 2 minutes left, okay, thank you. Or you can use session printers, which are basically network printers for faster networks, because of the traffic they need to send from the print server back to the printer. So it's important that they're close together, or at least that the connections between the two are fast enough bandwidth. And with session printers, you basically specify a specific network printer or multiple to be assigned to a user or a group of users to be met within their session. And those can then be filtered by policies on IP addresses or subnets, for example, to again enable proximity printing. And it sort of looks like this with proximity printers. Again, session established. Because the user is in subnet 1, he or she will get network printer 1 and vice versa. Subnet 2, session established. He or she will get network printer 2 because he or she will be in subnet 2 with regards to proximity printing, of course, but this can be used alongside your normal printing policy. So if you also have a default policy where the default printer gets mapped within the user session, that will still work as well. So you can use them alongside each other. For proximity printing to work, you will have to install and enable the universal print server, otherwise you can't work with proximity printing. It won't work without UPS. And oh man, I just made it, I see, because this one I have talked about a few times already. So, and that's it, the end. Thank you very much for joining my session, and if you have any questions, please address them to Eric. He will hand them over to me, or contact me through my website or whatever, and I'll try to come up with a blog post answering all your questions as good as I can. So thank you very much.